California, California, streaming on such a winter's day. It's hot as balls. It's not winter. I wish it was winter. My God. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to a Thursday stream brought to you by the Bitchuation Room podcast. I am Francesca Fiorentini. Thank you so much for joining us in the middle of your day, wherever you are. I see there's someone sweating balls in Ireland for no reason. Yeah, it's the end of the world as we know it. All right, I'm done. Welcome to the show. This is what it is. It's me singing, and then we're just going to straight talk about Cuban communism for an hour. My friend Nato Green is here, obviously friend of the show. You guys know him and love him. He's taking some time out of his busy union organizing schedule to be here. So thank you so much. Hit the like button, share this stream right now. We're getting into Cuba. We're getting into Haiti. If there's some time left over, I'm going to talk about James Carville, the Democratic strategist in biggest air quotes ever. And once again, you can become a patron of this show, good people. If you support and love this content and you love this show, hey, why not kick us some money? Patreon.com/bitchuationroom, $5, $10 gets you a shout out. $20 is going to enter you into a world of merch that will be dope. I am working on it right now. And also, if you're listening as a podcast in the future, what up? Give this podcast 5 stars. That is super sweet. That is solidaridad, as they say. My hair is dirty. Also, if you're on a podcast, you're not seeing that. So that's good. All right, here he is, you guys. You've seen him from this show. Please welcome Mr. Nato Green. Hi, Nato.
It's 64 degrees in San Francisco right now.
You know, this is I usually hate summers in SF because they don't exist and they're cold as hell and they're just blustery. But the rest of the world is so hot that I'm like, no, that's the right place. Yeah,
as you know, the twins.
Yes.
One of the twins is currently doing surf camp here, where it's 57 degrees in the morning when they go surfing.
Amazing.
And the other twin is right now backpacking in Yosemite, where it's like 175 degrees. And according to the latest weather forecast, about to have those like dry lightning strikes that will encender el mundo.
So that's interesting that like the one that's like not surfing in the Pacific in like crazy waves is like actually being a little bit, it's like a tougher situation. You'd think that Yosemite would be like the safer choice for summer activities, but it's not. Yeah, no, camping's canceled. Climate change canceled camping, which is really music to many people's ears. But
my ears, hell yes. Are you kidding me? I was like, I mean, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but like in San Francisco, people have been like all these people are complaining about crime in the city and how unsafe they feel in the city. And I'm like, I feel so much safer in the city than I do in the countryside because I'm a city guy. Like I understand how to read city danger. Do you know what I mean? Like, whereas when I'm out in the woods, it's like everything is deliverance. Everything is like white supremacist, hillbilly Nazis, and
Uh-huh.
bears coming to kill me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a
So
time to kill plus deliverance plus misery
right, all of it.
plus, I don't know, Jason, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yep.
it's true. It's
Blair Witch Project, all of it.
it's an elaborate way of saying you're afraid of the dark. I appreciate that.
You know, like
I'm a city kid.
I'm a city kid. I'm just much more comfortable. Being like I would rather. I like knowing that if I start screaming because I'm being stabbed to death in my home, that my neighbors can hear me.
Sure, they won't do anything about
They
it
won't
because
do
San
anything.
Francisco has changed.
Yeah.
That's so funny. I've got Mark O'Brien on YouTube says I feel scared as fuck in the country. Lol. I can't tell if he's in the country or he's like when he goes to the country.
Yeah.
Speaking of countries, great segue. We're gonna talk about Cuba, and places where it's hot as balls. Right now in Cuba, July in Cuba,
and sticky. Yeah.
so sticky. So Nato talked about his twins, who are his kids, and he and his fam have spent time in Cuba. I have visited, like a gringa when Obama was nicer to us. So we're going to talk about what's been going on. I want to play some clips. I want to get people's reactions because, it is a volatile and very like polarized political situation. And I think it's important to suss it out and talk about it from a progressive and a leftist perspective, from an anti-imperialist perspective, maybe from even like a socialist communist perspective. Although, let's pace ourselves here. But so thank you so much for chiming in. Feel free to send in questions, but let's just, get right to what has been happening. And I have, a few clips to sort of bring us up to speed. But as you know, this week, thousands of Cubans have been taking to the streets to protest the economic crisis that has been happening there. Now, this is not necessarily the economic crisis that the right would have you believe, which is communism. But it is the worst economic crisis the country's faced since like the early 90s after the Soviet Union fell. Cuba relied a lot on money from the Soviet Union, but so the economy shrunk like 10% in this last year. COVID has hit it horribly, not health-wise until recently, but because the country relied so much on tourism. The other thing that happened is that these Trump sanctions, he boosted the sanctions on Cuba. Those hit at the end of 2020, and now we're sort of seeing also the reverberations. So there's a number of things that are at play. What that means for people in the streets and people in their homes: shortages of food, shortages of medicine, shortages of electricity, rolling blackouts. So, Texas in the year 2021. And all of us when the pandemic hit, every time we see food lines, of course, the United States, we're like, this is capitalism, right? But anyway, we'll get into that. So I just wanted to play a little clip of this independent journalist from an organization called Belly of the Beast, which does independent reporting from Cuba. His name is Daniel Montero, and he was on Democracy Now! And I really appreciated what he had to say. And then, Nato, I want to sort of get your initial thoughts on sort of the this first wave, like this, what has been happening and why. Here he is. Let me see if I can correctly do this. Bueno. Okay, here we go.
What happened this July 11th was historical. There's no denying that. I mean, not since 1994, thousands of people had taken to the streets. And back then, it had to do with another major economic crisis we had, that one caused by the fall of the Soviet Union. The thing is that right now, a big number of things have combined. Like, we're not only going through the hardest moment of the pandemic in Cuba. We had been doing very well with the pandemic so far, but in the last months, things have not been well. We have thousands of cases. At the same time, there's big lines people need to do just to acquire the basics. There's no medicine. So all of these things have come together. And at the same time, I would say that everything people are seeing on media, especially media based out of Florida, that people now, everyone has access to internet in Cuba. I would say that the picture they're painting to their audience is that one of a country falling to pieces, we need help from wherever we can get it. So I think that when all of these things came together, then this happened. Several cities across the country, people went to the streets, and of course the biggest ones happened here in Havana. I was in downtown Havana. I saw thousands of people there. They were calling for the end of communism. They were calling for a change. But the combination is interesting because when you hear the things they're saying when they sing together, it's all about the politics of it. But when you talk to them, we were doing interviews in the streets. When you talk to them, they were just like, we just want more food. We just want medicine. We just want the basics. And I think that is quite an interesting combination. There were violent encounters in the streets. In the area I was in.
Okay, I'm going to stop him right there and just sort of talk about that. So it's sort of what I was saying before, but he was basically like, some people are calling for the end of communism, but also when you ask them, what exactly are you talking about? People will talk about the very real conditions that are being suffered right now. But Nato, can you give me your sense of having lived in Cuba and having sort of what those conditions are and what they are not as compared to maybe other countries in Latin America or the Caribbean, and whether you saw some of this like initial unrest and sort of grumblings as well when you were there not so long ago?
Yeah. I mean, the crux of my point is to think of Cuba as a normal place. And to think of Cubans as normal people, and what that means is that in the United States, when people talk about Cuba, it's as an argument for an abstract idea about is socialism a success or a failure, full
Yes.
stop, binary question, and that's a very like outside view, and what similarly, like, some people have been posting that, when the Black Lives Matter marches happened last summer, some people were calling for a complete abolition of the U.S. state, but most people wanted police to stop killing Black people. And
Right.
so, it's the nature of protests that people show up wanting all kinds of different things, right? The Women's March included a range of people who just wanted Hillary Clinton to be the capitalist, warmonger, imperialist president, and people who were anarchists. It was the whole spectrum, right?
Yeah, it was a beautiful time.
It was a beautiful time.
Moment.
It was a united front. In San Francisco, we have this guy Frank Chu who shows up at protests in a suit with a homemade sign that says 12 galaxies guilty to a Blacktronic society, and he's like a local. And here everybody knows oh, that's a local character. Frank Chu is here with his Blacktronic society sign, but it's if someone from another country came in and were like, all of San Francisco believes in the Blacktronic society, that would be nonsense. You know what I mean? So,
dude, I want to now know more about the Blacktronic Society, but that's a different pod.
So,
yeah.
When you're older. So and Cuba is, so when there are problems, Cuba definitely has problems. And in some ways, people on the left in the U.S. sort of come at it from the place of very solidarity with the Cuban people and the Cuban Revolution and anti-imperialism. And I get all that, but also I've spent enough time in Cuba and have enough friends there, that I have to be a little bit measured about that because my Cuban friends are pretty pissed off. That there's a high level of frustration with how messed up things are. But mostly, like the dude was saying, I know some people who are socialism failed. That's their perspective.
In Cuba.
Mm-hmm. We're evidence that socialism failed. But there's a whole lot more people who like the idea that of a safe country with no violence and no drugs and no gangs and no crime, who like the idea of universal literacy and universal education, who like the idea of mass subsidy for the arts and transit, who like the idea of everyone having health care, right? That there's a lot of stuff that people take a lot of pride in and really care about, and they don't want unfettered capitalism. They don't want to be like Haiti, which is really the alternative. What they want is enough food and enough money, and some of that, and because it's like some of that is clearly the fault of the U.S. embargo,
Yeah.
but it's like people there's and people don't like the embargo, but the people that I knew, like I heard a bunch of people say, I'm sick of blaming the U.S. for all of our problems. Like, I'm sick. Like, we have to take some responsibility. Like, I wrote this piece about Cuba in the LA Review of Books when I was there, and I showed it to a Cuban friend, and he was like, "This is all right, Nato, but I think you were too easy on us. You didn't say enough about our own victim complex as a people." And I was like, "Dude, I'm not going to write that. That's your story." So the
but I think that's interesting that you even say that. Like it even feels weird to even say that we are an anti-capitalist anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, politically, and a progressive show, and even sort of talk about Cuba in a way that it does feel semi-paternalistic and like, well, what gives you the right, and why are we even having this conversation? And it is nothing gives us the right, literally nothing. Right. and I think, but I think
I'm available to tell anyone how to run their country if they want. Like, it's not Cuba, U.S., Israel, Philippines, whatever. I'm here for you.
Hey, yeah. I got a tip jar, patreon.com. But I do think because of the U.S.'s historical involvement in Cuba and the proximity to the United States just in terms of distance, right? 90 miles or whatever it is from Florida, and the number of Cuban Americans and immigrants who now live here, I feel like the fates are tied. And that doesn't give us a right to be paternalistic or discuss it in a paternalizing way. But I just wanted to name that it is, it's an interesting exercise anyway.
It's huge. I mean, there's a way, like, Cuba is important in a way that, like, is not the case of a lot of other countries with 11 million people. Like in terms of our, just from the beginning, Columbus sails the ocean blue, comes to Cuba, 1492. Like, Pirates of the Caribbean, that's about Cuba.
I love how you went from Columbus to Johnny Depp. Look,
slavery, like Cuba, like was the second to last country in the Americas to end slavery. Like, there's basically 100 years continuously of slave rebellion and uprising prior to the Fidel's revolution in 1959. The Cuba's incredibly important in the history of the American mafia, and the mafia getting set up in the U.S. Havana was Vegas before Vegas was. Like, the counterinsurgency strategies that the U.S. ends up developing in Vietnam were first attempted in Cuba and failed in the Bay of Pigs, and then get refined in Vietnam. Like, both the Cuban left and the Cuban right, like, ends up being a through line since, for the last 60 years, that are important. Like, the Cuban right turns up again and again across the Americas as whether it's in involvement with dictatorships and coups in other countries in South America or in Central America, involved in the drug trade. The Cuban left ends up being an inspiration. Cuba is sending people to. Cuba is the only third world country to project itself in foreign policy terms internationally in that way. Like, Cuba plays a critical role in ending apartheid in South Africa. Like, if you talk to South Africans, revolutionaries who were part of that, who were like, that Cuba sent thousands of soldiers to Angola. It was the first military defeat of the apartheid government in the 70s. That was a turning point. That was like the first crack in the edifice of apartheid. And so South Africans have this incredible, connection because of Cuban solidarity in the Angolan struggle. So, like, there's this incredible
and I think the other part of it is that, the revolution was successful, right? And like, I think, what are we now? 40, 60 years of success or relative success is successful, right? I mean, I think the United States has largely backed off in the last 30 years. I mean, it has resulted to, after Bay of Pigs, after the assassination attempts, has resulted to crippling sanctions, but largely has given up trying to coup Cuban leaders. Now, I also just want to say, I've only visited Cuba once. It was for a week. I had been living in Argentina before that for 5 years. We've talked about this a billion times. I've lived in Buenos Aires, a city that is insanely unequal when it comes to class and the economy, in terms of, children rifling through trash in the street while, tourists and others eat, steaks in outdoor settings or whatever. Like that is, and it is perpetual. And you cannot go to certain neighborhoods, as a tourist at night, or as anyone at night, because you will be robbed, you will be kidnapped. There is an insane amount of crime, but actually relatively low crime, like in relationship to the amount of inequality that exists in a city like Buenos Aires, a city like Rio, a city like Sao Paulo, so many other cities throughout Latin America. And when I went to Cuba, I was like, oh, I'm walking through the streets at 11 p.m. in a neighborhood I've never been in before. Yes, I speak Spanish. That's nothing. It doesn't matter. I was like, people don't seem like they're about to, like that they need to rob me and take my phone to like make ends meet. No, that could be because the consequences for them doing so would be far greater. But like, I've never actually been in a place that felt that safe in Latin America as Cuba. I'm like, as Havana, I felt incredibly safe. In other countries, capitalist countries, incredibly unsafe.
Right.
So I just wanted to like name that. And the other thing, like, these are anecdotes, and I know, Nato, you've got a billion of them, but like, I remember this woman like talked to me and she was like, oh, did you bring any like dresses or shirts from the United States that you could like give me? And, and I was like, I'm sorry, I don't have anything, and she's like, oh, we don't have any, like, we don't have nice stores here. We really want stores. And I was like, yeah, we've got nice stores, but we don't have healthcare for all, or like, good education. And she was like, oh, she looked at me with this like disgust, like, oh, that sucks. Those are important things to me.
Yeah, I mean, trying to like explain to Cubans how like we have massacres in the United States, like a gunman will walk into a place and open fire and kill 50 people. They're just like, that's horrific. Like people will get arrested in your city for being homeless. That's horrible. So, but again, it's like so there's this incredible deprivation there. Like there's not enough food, like there's not enough money, and I think if I were like so people have frustrations with the government, and because the government controls the economy, sort of the default is like to be mad at the government about stuff. Like there's no sense of personal responsibility, or like you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, because the government runs the whole economy. So like there's no one else to blame, like to take your protest to. And it's there's a level of there's a real generational divide. Like the people who sort of came into adulthood before the fall of the Soviet Union still have some memory of like the sort of good old days of revolutionary strength, and people who became adults in the 90s or later only, in my experience, are much more cynical because their memories, are only of hardship.
The 90s were rough.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Soviet Union falls in '89, and in the next 6 years, caloric intake of the Cuban people dropped by almost 30%. So like the Cubans will say, like, we went to sleep rich and we woke up poor, and like living through the special period, like you talk to people who hunted cats or ate like sauteed banana peels in olive oil and onions, or ate sponges like to survive. And so it was a real like generational trauma what they went through in the special period, and they're going through it again. But it's not like when I say that people are mad at the government, like there's usually not like, I want the government to change these 4 policies. It's not that specific. It's just like, we're broke and we want things to be better. And I mean, the other thing I would say is, like, just to put it in the broader context of Latin America, like, as much as people are like, there are protests in Cuba and therefore people want an end to the entire system of government and unfettered capitalism. Like literally a month earlier, there were 19 people were killed in protests in Colombia over the same shit.
Yeah.
And the president in Colombia is a right-wing Trump supporter, and no one is drawing similar conclusions about Colombia. Like, the problems of Cuba are problems of, I said, like, Cuba, I said to somebody recently, Cuba is a plundered Caribbean country first and a socialist country second. And they were, the person I was talking to was from the Caribbean, and they were like, plundered Caribbean country is redundant. They're all plundered.
No, and I think that that's really important to remember, that the situation gets so politicized when it is just about basic needs, right? And I do think that it is at once a reflection, but also not a reflection of the so-called failures of communism. But what I do think is a reflection of is a success of reform to the Communist Party in Cuba. The fact that there are these protests that we haven't seen, right, in 30 years or whatever, the world hasn't seen, it's not unrelated to the fact that the government has been more liberal when it comes to internet use. Now they've been revoking it and sort of using it as like a weapon against their own people when, there's protests organized. But it's like, not having the internet in the year 2020 or 2021, I would amount to like kind of a human rights violation, like that feels totalitarian and is. But so it's interesting how
you not being able to take selfies is exactly like being shot to death in a soccer stadium. It's the same thing.
Fuck you, first of all. But it is. But not having access to the outside world and not having access to information. And I think what's interesting about that is that the government knows that once they allow for the internet, they open themselves up to all kinds of information and misinformation from spreading. They open themselves up to, rallies being organized from outside agitators or rallies being organized from inside agitators. There's all kinds of stuff that happens when you do that. But I think it is good that they are moving in that direction, and they have been moving in a direction of reform over the last few years, if not, maybe not fast enough for some. But I do want to just say that let's go back to what's going on now. So in response to these protests, the president, who is not a Castro brother right now, right? Diaz-Canel, who, talking about the protests, said there were three kinds of protesters: counter-revolutionaries, criminals, and those with legitimate frustrations, which I think is very funny. They were like, and there's some people with legitimate frustrations, because most governments don't give people even that. If like there's one agitator or criminal, they're like, everyone's a criminal, right? We know that. But Cuba announced Wednesday it was temporarily lifting restrictions on the amount of food and medicine travelers could bring into the country, in an apparent small concession to demands by protesters who took to the streets last weekend. So it's one small thing. But Nato, is this in terms of people who are actually like tourists who are visiting, or Cubans who are coming back to bring like goods back?
Yeah, if you're flying into Cuba, if you're like at the airport in Florida or in Mexico, where the places that I've flown in through, or and actually, no, if you're boarding a flight outside of Cuba, what you will see is a lot of Cubans, a lot of people flying into Cuba, either Cubans going home or people going to visit family in Cuba with like basic necessities, like people flying back with tires, toilet seat covers, vacuums, like tons of stuff. So there's just a shortage of basic stuff, and so people bring back supplies. And I apparently, this is a bit bananas to me, but apparently because of COVID, they were restricting how much stuff people could bring back, to like expedite people getting through the quarantine or checkpoints or whatever.
And a lot of the reasons people don't have that is because of the embargo itself, correct?
Yeah, when we say the embargo, we're actually talking about a bunch of different policy components. There's the Helms-Burton Act that was adopted in the 90s and signed by President Clinton, that is it's a statute that limits trade with Cuba, but there's a bunch of exemptions. And under Trump tightened a bunch of those exemptions. And so in response to the so-called the Sonic attacks. Do you remember, people remember the Sonic attacks? And so
Was
there
this the
were
Havana syndrome?
the Havana syndrome. Yeah, um,
That is such a crazy story.
it was so weird, and like we got there right after that, right after Trump closed the embassies. We were there in 2015, the week before Obama, the week before they opened the embassies, and then we were there we got back right after they closed the embassies, and um, like like people are always blasting Hotel California, and I was like, there it is, the Sonic attacks. It's the Eagles every time.
It was basically something where like American diplomats were getting like vicious headaches after visiting Havana, and no one could like figure out why. And I just love the idea that there like some Cuban like spy entity was like practicing their like Despicable Me radar, like ray gun on like our diplomats.
Yeah,
if even that, or maybe it was just like the heat and the the humidity.
They got sleepy. Yeah, and I mean, and to be clear, like the Cuban government was so emphatic that they weren't behind it that they invited the FBI to come and investigate.
Damn, so crazy.
So there's the embargo, but then there's also Trump closed the embassy in the U.S. embassy in Havana, which means that if Cubans want to come to the United States, they need to go to a third country to get a visa. So like what you'll see in Havana is there's like these huge lines of people outside the embassies of Panama or Mexico or whatever, and people will go to those countries, have appointments at the U.S. embassy in order to come to the United States, and that just makes it that much more prohibitive. In addition, they limited the amount of money people could send back on as cash remittances, so that that would alleviate suffering immediately for Cubans in the U.S. to be able to send money back. Then they limited how much how much stuff people like cigars and rum that people can bring back to the United States. And then they limited a bunch of like the certain categories of tourism that are that Cuba is incredibly reliant on. So like under Obama, under the so-called Obama thaw, there was this huge growth in the kinds of tourism that were possible. There were cruise ships going in. There was like lots of airlines announcing regular flights to Havana, and then all that dried up under Trump. And so, and because
let me just read a little bit of that before you get into the because, but to double down on what Nato said, even though he's doing an amazing job summarizing it, I love Council on Hemispheric Relations, or Affairs, Council on Hemispheric Affairs. They have great primers and backgrounders. So this is reminder that actually one of the good things about the Obama administration was the amount of work that was done to normalize or try to attempt to normalize relations with Cuba. So let's remember it was a backdoor deals. They were hidden from the right wing. They were hidden from the right wing media. But Obama and John Kerry and like Pope Francis and some other fools like all worked to
Senator Patrick Leahy played an important role.
Leahy.
My favorite detail about it is that it also involves a suitcase full of semen. For real.
Jesus Christ. What? You need to explain this now.
So in December of 2014, there's the beginning of this Obama thaw between the U.S. and Cuba, and the sort of the issue that forced it is that there was a U.S. citizen who was detained in Cuba because the Cuban government believed he was a spy. Around the same time, the Cuban Five were Cubans that were arrested in the United States, and they were being detained. And so sort of the starting point of the thaw basically was a prisoner exchange.
Right.
But Patrick Leahy and Pope Francis and others are involved in this like clandestine diplomacy to try to lay the foundation for it. And one of the goodwill gestures of to lubricate the relationship was they took sperm from one of the Cuban Five in his prison cell in the United States and delivered it to his wife in Cuba to get her pregnant. So at some point,
do we know it was a full suitcase? Because it has a lot of sperm.
there was a lot of ice packs in it also.
Sure. Yeah, how do you? I guess you freeze? I don't know. But That's amazing. Okay, so yeah, just again, so in 2008, Barack Obama said isolating Cuba had failed to advance U.S. interests and it was time to pursue diplomacy with the Castro regime. Several weeks after taking office, he eased restrictions on remittances, so that's sending money back from the United States to Cuba, and travel, allowing Cuban Americans to send unlimited money to Cuba and permitting U.S. citizens to visit Cuba for religious and educational purposes. I said I was Mormon. No, I didn't. I just went. As Obama began softening U.S. policy toward Cuba, the island signaled openness to reform under the new leadership of Fidel's brother Raul. Facing an aging population, a heavy foreign debt, and economic hardship amid the global downturn, Raul began liberalizing Cuba's state control economy in 2009. So the things I was talking about. Reforms included decentralizing the agricultural sector, relaxing restrictions on small businesses, like Airbnbs, allowing Airbnbs to operate, opening up real estate markets, allowing Cubans to travel abroad more freely, and expanding access to consumer goods. Cuba's private sector swelled as a result, and the number of self-employed workers nearly tripled between 2009 and 2013. Then there's the stuff, they don't talk about the seamen, sadly. But I really want to just read the stuff that Trump has done. Here, this is easier. So in the Trump era, in addition to ending almost all individual travel to the island, Trump banned group educational exchanges in 2019. His administration prohibited cruise ships and other vessels from sailing between the U.S. and Cuba, banned U.S. flights to Cuban cities other than Havana. He also suspended private charter flights to Havana and barred U.S. travelers from staying at hundreds of establishments linked to the Cuban government or the Communist Party. Administration officials framed the travel bans in an effort to keep tourism dollars out of Cuban government coffers. The White House further targeted Cuba's finances by curbing remittances and imposing economic sanctions. In 2018, the UN estimated that the U.S. trade restrictions had cost Cuba more than $130 billion since the embargo began. And that same year, power transferred over to Diaz-Canel. I think there was another estimate that, just in 2020 alone, the country's lost $5 billion, something like this. But so that's where we are now. Who can stop these sanctions? How could we end them?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that should be said is that, there's a couple things happening simultaneously, which is there's the current protests that are about the economic pressures and the burdens of COVID and food shortages and lines and scarcity, and all that stuff. In addition, for some time, there's been something called the San Isidro movement. San Isidro is a neighborhood in Havana, there's been a bunch of artists protesting around freedom of speech and free assembly, and protesting against censorship in Cuba. So, right. Interestingly, so the kinds of debates around censorship in Cuba come up, for example, in government standards around obscenity, and perceptions that reggaeton is promoting obscenity. There's also
it is proudly, very, very proudly.
There was a decree, some policy that came out that was incredibly controversial around artistic expression. Artists were protesting it. When they again, just to be sort of precise and specific, in the U.S., people are sort of fast and loose with describing Cuba as a dictatorship, and Cubans do not, historically have the reason these protests are so significant is that there's not a robust culture of public dissent in Cuba, but at the same time, unlike in other dictatorships, there's also not, mass graves and executions. The dissidents that I talked to, people knew who was spying on them for the government. It was a lot of, what I would describe as soft coercion. I got picked up by the police when I was there too, and it was I think it was a typical experience sense. That a lot of, not that I'm a Cuban dissident, but that a lot of critical artists experience, which is they get picked up by the police, they get held for a few hours, they get released, or they get held for a day. It's just there's a lot of low intensity harassment of dissent. And
did you have to do your bits? Did you have to do stand up for the Cuban police?
I was walking down the street with my Zoom audio recorder talking into it. and
Oh.
and left-wing expat comedian podcaster is not a meaningful concept to them. They were like, what is a podcast? So they were like, this is the sonic attack. We found the guy, this hooked, multi-track recorder. So basically I got held in the police station until they found someone who understood English well enough that I could play back the tape and they could hear me being like, yeah, and then, I think a rule of three joke would really work here. And they're like, yeah, this guy actually isn't CIA. So
finish what you were saying,
Yeah, so I was just saying that there's that what I think is important to remember is there's also domestic struggle in Cuba underway about gay rights, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a gay rights movement that's advocating for more rights, and there's evangelicals that are pushing back against that. And so there's at a high level, there is a bunch of internal dissent and things that are struggling over that are being expressed on the streets right now, and there are also people who want an end to communism and want to change the whole government. And so, but I think it would be, the problem that we're seeing with how it gets talked about in the United States is there's a whole range of things happening in Cuba right now, and people want a whole range of things. And then the people who are the sort of hardcore anti-communists are quick to seize on the moment and be like, 100% of these people want an end to communism, and they want full-throated capitalism, and they want to change the whole government system. And
right.
it's the same talking point that those people have been saying for the last 60 years.
Well, let's take it in parts, because Mama's got to clip these up later, so it has to be we got to go piece by piece. So talking about the sanctions that Trump ramped up, the lack of remittances, the prohibitions on remittances, the prohibitions on travel, and all this, and basically cutting off the Cuban people, even more so. And I always say, look, if you think sanctions actually punishes the so-called dictator in charge and starves them, look at Kim Jong-un. That fool looks starved to you? I mean, now he's lost weight or some shit, but no. It doesn't matter. The people
just did keto.
Yeah, exactly. That's the level that he's at. He's like, no, I'm only going to eat meat. Meanwhile, North Koreans are definitely starving. So it's not hitting who you think it's going to hit. This pressure is not working. So who can stop the sanctions? Who can end the blockade? Biden. Just like dropping student debt is in his hands, ending the embargo is in Biden's hands. This is from Arturo Dominguez, who wrote for Latino Rebels. The conversation about Cuba is complex. Are you willing to have it? And he points out that just last month, the United Nations voted against the United States, voted against a UN resolution that condemned the economic embargo for the 29th year in a row. Additionally, that opposition came as an outright refusal to return to Obama-era policies, thus maintaining the additional sanctions imposed by the Trump administration. 2019, Anthony Faiola for the Washington Post criticized the Trump administration's sanctions as being responsible for creating, quote, deepening disruptions to foreign supply chains, scaring off some of the Canadian and other banks that have helped finance $2 billion in food imports annually. Right, so these are companies that don't want to be sued. They don't want to be, slapped with any whatever lawsuits or fines for doing business in Cuba. And again, they're not building luxury condos. It's a food program. Biden's not doing anything. So here's a statement that Biden put out. We stand with the Cuban people in their clarion call for freedom and relief from the tragic grip of the pandemic. Okay, give them fucking vaccines then. And from the decades of repression and economic suffering to which they have been subjected by the United States, Cuba's authoritarian regime. The Cuban people are bravely asserting fundamental and universal rights. Those including the right of peaceful protest, the right to freely determine their own future, must be respected. The United States calls on the Cuban regime to hear their people and serve their needs at this vital moment rather than enriching themselves. Beyond the insane amount of hypocrisy, if you can ignore the hypocrisy, if you can ignore the fact that the United States is the reason that the Cubans have been under economic duress, it's a pretty good statement. It's pretty fair.
I mean, the it's the basic, the basic issue is that, like, if what you care about is easing the suffering of the Cuban people, there's one set of policies the United States would follow. If what you really care about is regime change in Cuba, then let's be clear that you don't actually stand with the Cuban people, and you don't care about humanitarian suffering, and and that's the policy that we're seeing. And it obviously, as other people pointed out, it's not in any way like ideologically consistent. Um, you know, Ostensibly China is a communist state, and the U.S. trades with them and has defended the policy of, constructive market engagement with China.
The U.S. and China is like, they're like our like cool rich friend that you like hang out with and like trade clothes with and like rely on and like eat free food at their place and whatever. And then like behind their backs are like, oh my God, China's like the worst. I hate China. No, they're terrible. Oh yeah, no, China is so mean. And then you're like, can I come over, China? China, here, can I wear your clothes? Let's hang.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Can I borrow all of your stuff?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's like the and so this is why I was saying this thing about it being a plundered Caribbean country. I mean, obviously, you were at the top. You said you were going to, you want to talk about Haiti, and like Haiti had the first successful slave revolution in the world, and was punished by having to pay back France for the value of the freed slaves for the next 100 years. And that fact is why, from the 1800s, is why Haiti continues to be a crippled, underdeveloped country to this day. So like the imperial center does not tolerate uppity people in the periphery.
The one thing I was going to say is that when I learned about the Cuban Revolution, right, happened in 1959, it felt like, and studying like anti-colonial movements and successful toppling of colonial governments like in Haiti and slave revolts, et cetera, and getting your colonizer out, that Cuba never really had that moment. That Cuba was just passed as a colony from different hands to different hands, from basically Spanish to American hands, correct? And like the Americans were essentially running shit. So 59, yeah, communism aside, it was an anti-colonial movement to regain autonomy and sovereignty for the Cuban people, who were kept in squalor and servitude and second-class citizenship and illiteracy and forgotten. And I think that is an interesting thing where you sort of, and I guess in other countries, I'm trying to think of which, but like you might see that in waves. First is the decolonial movement, anti-colonial movement, and then comes maybe a communist movement. This happened all at once. It felt like the actual anti-colonial moment was their revolution.
Yeah, I think right. I think so to recap the history for the listeners. So, Cuba is a Spanish colony until 1898, and what we call the Spanish-American War, and Cubans call the War of Independence. Basically, the Cuban independence fighters make a devil's bargain with the U.S. to align with the U.S. to get the Spanish out. That's successful. That's where we get Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders.
Keep going. I have to talk to the vet.
Okay. And so they get the Spanish out, but as a result, the resulting post-independence Cuba, there's what they call the Platt Amendment, which remained in effect in Cuba for many years, that gave the U.S. the unilateral right to intervene militarily. And so even though Cuba wasn't formally a colony after the Spanish-American War, the Cuban War of Independence, the U.S. had effective military control, intervened repeatedly, like dozens of times over the subsequent decades, and had a pretty strong hand in selecting who was going to be the head of state and how the government was going to run. And it was, really designed to be a receptive environment for U.S. investments in terms of the hotel industry, mafia, sugar exports, and other things like that. while we wait for her to come back, I'll take questions from the chat. BV, Cuba is vaccinated. They also medically developed 2 vaccines. Yeah, so Cuba has developed COVID vaccines. They have, last I checked, been able to vaccinate about 1 million of their 11 million people. They haven't been able to vaccinate as many of their people as they had wanted to, because of the embargo. Their ability to produce vaccines at scale is limited, and so the vaccines are effective, but they have rolled out more slowly than they would have liked. Todd, yeah, I like Black Widow pretty well. Thanks for asking.
No. We're back to Cuba. I'm so sorry. So my cat is getting dental work done today. She got her. This is so sad, you guys. She got one of her fangs removed. So you're gonna be a one fang kitty. It's so sad. Nato doesn't care. He's looking at your comments. So I have to go. I don't have to go, but Matt is gonna go pick her up. Poor Chitty. She's all woken up now, so I'm sure the drugs are wearing off. Anyway, did you go over the history of Cuba?
I went over the history of Cuba, and I talked some about the Cuban vaccine programs.
Okay, great.
So,
well, I wanted to obviously NATO referenced, and we've been talking about the ways that what's happening in Cuba is being super politicized by the far right, and also, folks on the left, although we don't have the power, i.e. a major news channel streaming 24 hours. We try. But, it's being misconstrued and immediately politicized and immediately seen as either a win or a defeat or a sign that communism is bad or good or X, Y, and Z. So here are our friends at Fox and Friends.
why are you going to do this to us?
Because it's important. Because this is the most watched network in the country. Here they are just sounding off about what's going on in Cuba. Here's how it's being framed by the right. Tell me if you can hear this.
No?
Okay. Fuck my life. Fuck my life. Fuck my life. Squaw. Can you hear this now?
In the streets of Cuba, and it came out because, okay, we know the coronavirus is an issue. We know that economically it put the whole world on its back, but people of Cuba want their freedom, and they finally feel bold enough to protest in the street in front of this brutal regime.
Yeah, chanting freedom, calling for the president to step down. They have a surge in the coronavirus cases, shortage of just basic goods, things that we all might take for granted they can't get in their country.
Well, like food. They need food, and they're hacked off about it. And that's why thousands went out in the streets yesterday. You never see this kind of dissent because it's always limited. And it's interesting because the communists did allow the dissent to go on for a couple of hours. On Twitter, there's some video of protesters turning over a police car. Looks like the United States. Another video, people.
Okay, that was my favorite part right there. People turning over a police car, it looks like the United States, is just the most blind, like one-to-one when it comes to what's happening in Cuba. It's like, oh, you mean like the Black Lives Matter protests? Or who are you for? Who are you with again? What are we about? Obviously, they're framing this all as like an anti-communist, like protests, etc. I'm going to play a little bit more. I'm sorry.
Looting from a government-run store. And here's the thing. We hear about, the government-run store. Everybody gets everything they want. The government-run store sells wildly overpriced stuff with currencies that most Cubans marching there in the streets of Havana don't own.
And Brian, you're friends with the mayor of Miami. You've talked to him. You've interviewed him. And he's...
Okay. NATO, reactions to what we just saw, and then I'm going to play more.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is that Cuba and its problems, and as we've been talking about, a lot of Cuba's problems are problems of Latin America, and the but it's going to be used domestically. Like it's not, it's not real. These people don't give a shit about about the Cuban people or about what's happening in Cuba. This is, it's like whatever you think about Diaz-Canel and the Cuban government, they're, this situation is going to be used. I mean, it was instantly, you can see it on Twitter, was being used against Bernie Sanders and AOC, and to argue against budget reconciliation,
Mm-hmm.
and the Green New Deal and Medicare for all and raising the minimum wage. So
And trans rights. Just throw that in there. Why not?
They're just, they're gonna pile on all that stuff. And it's all like, so there's this hope that I think, centrist Democrats have, that they could somehow walk a line, and be enough anti-communist that they're not going to get red baited. It doesn't work. Like, they were denouncing Obama as a communist. They were saying that talk about Biden and Kamala Harris as radical leftists, and giving into the radical left and the socialist left. Like, they're going to red bait anyone to the left of Ted Cruz, no matter what they do. So
yes.
Okay.
But even and even Democrats play into this all the time, right? Senator Hernandez, I believe, is his last name, and Bob Menendez, his name is. Apologies. Plays into this all the time. Democrats, especially like more centrist, conservative leaning Democrats, Latinos, are always asked to and always sort of expected to like veer right when it comes to any policy in Latin America that whiffs. It's almost like an exchange. Okay, we'll let more Latino representation in the United States Congress, but you got to dunk on Cuba and communism and Venezuela and socialism. That's like barrier to entry. And then we can hold you up. Look at Ted Cruz and his dad, or Marco Rubio. Like, this is, and again, it's Republicans, and it's also Democrats.
And they don't just stop as you have to dunk on communism, but you also have to be opposed to agrarian reform in Latin America. You have to be opposed to the countries that have nationalized their oil supply.
That's all communism, though.
Right.
I mean, you ally yourself with the elites of all of these countries, and by and large, those elites are living in Miami. Are living in New York, or haven't lived in their countries for years. Anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off, but yes, I want to play a little bit more, because you've got the Miami mayor who is calling for just a straight up coup in response to people protesting for no electricity, like blackouts and food. Yeah. Time to coup.
Been tweeting about this, and he's been.
The regime must end.
Oh, hang on. I didn't even share this. Franny by herself, except for Nato here.
Must end now.
Something he had to say.
The regime must end now. It is not negotiable. We ask for an international intervention led by the United States to protect the Cuban people from a bloodbath. Cubans are worthy and ready to rule themselves without tyranny. It can end today, and it must end today. The implications of this moment can mean freedom for millions of people in this hemisphere.
Wow. Did he rehearse that? I feel like he rehearsed that extra special in the mirror. It can end today, and it will end today, and I am securing my re-election here in Miami.
And people make fun of San Francisco politicians for passing resolutions about sweatshops and whatever. Like, nobody's like, why is this fucking mayor get to have an opinion about foreign policy? Like, how about you get the buses running?
But I mean, it is, to me, hearing that, I am like, it's so dangerous to dabble in that language. And yet, I have to sort of temper myself and remember that he is just kind of gunning for re-election, and he has to placate the largely, not solely, but largely far, right wing voting Miami Cubans. But like, it's so scary to me because you're like, what are you doing? It's going to end today. The United States must get involved. What does he want? Does he want boots on the ground? Is that what people are straight up calling for now? Because that's what it feels like, and feels like where we're headed. I have no illusions that this is going to actually lead to something like that. Thank God. I was even listening, I was listening to like Ben Rhodes, who was Obama's White House security, on his national security team. Ben Rhodes is by no means like anti-imperialist. I'm sure he supported Obama and his diplomatic endeavors in Cuba, but he's definitely not the no boots on the ground guy. And even he is like, no, we cannot, we need to not intervene anymore in countries like Cuba. And it's way too soon. And again, saying the same thing, most people just kind of want to have more food, bro, and have the electricity working, and getting basic medicine. And they don't necessarily want an end to the current administration. But I guess,
and what makes me nervous is that there are a lot of, people who are otherwise liberal, like people that you and I know who were out at Black Lives Matter marches and volunteered to elect Biden, people who think of themselves as progressive people, who see these protests and are responding to when the protest started on Sunday, the hashtag that was
SOS Cuba,
was SOS Cuba, and I looked at it, and all the accounts boosting it were these diehard right wing. They weren't just. It wasn't the SOS Cuba. The amplification of it wasn't just coming from the island. It was it was a a foreign right wing attempt to amplify it and take it over, so that it wasn't just about what the Cuban people were protesting for, but about these more general calls for complete regime change and intervention. And so it just gets real slippery, with for people calling for the Cuban people want an end to dictatorship and freedom. Well, maybe they do, but the U.S. should still stay out of it. And if just to be I don't want to sound overly conspiratorial, but in these moments when suddenly people are in the streets, Diaz-Canel has said that they believe that there's paid agitators, and to some extent that minimizes the fact that there is definitely some domestic discontent, but there's probably also definitely outside agitators. And historically with Cuba, over the years, there have been points where, whether it was Nixon or Clinton, where the administration was sort of softening and looking for openings, and then the security establishment would do something to torpedo that. Some of that was the context of the whole, the Elian Gonzalez scandal, if you remember that.
Yes. Oh my God.
But
so I
wouldn't be surprised at all if in 20 years documents were declassified that showed the extent of CIA involvement in what's happening this week in Cuba.
I also think that the Biden administration is inheriting a Mike Pompeo Secretary of State office and regime, right, or sort of mentality. And we don't even have diplomats in the embassy in Cuba right now. Americans don't have diplomats in the embassy, which you think would be kind of important if we cared about diplomacy. But I guess that's another thing where one of the few really shining moments of the Obama administration was the diplomacy around Cuba, because it was done behind closed doors in a good way, because it allowed for the situation to not be politicized to death. And it allowed for actual diplomacy to take place. And I wonder, are there agitators on the right that the United States is supporting? Or maybe there's diplomacy happening from the Biden administration. I don't know. I wanted to play, of course, what someone like Marco Rubio thinks is happening, which is that Biden is a secret communist And, we wish.
I don't know why it's so hard for them to criticize Marxists. I do think, and it's pretty clear that there are people out there that aren't saying anything. And the president took a whole day to say it. At least he finally said something. He still left out the word Marxist and communist and socialist. What you just described, the murderous nature of the Castro regime, that's the way every Marxist regime has ever been, always. Because Marxism and socialism is built on this. You go to a people and you say, there's this group of good, noble people, and then there's this group of oppressors that is trying to destroy them. Give us the power to crush the oppressors. And if you give us the power, we're going to give you security, we're going to give you a stable economy, we're going to give you all the things you need. But the price of that, of course, is your freedom. So they win, and then what happens? You don't get those things, and you don't get your freedom back. And then if you complain about it, they crack your head open, they put you in jail, they exile you, or they kill you. And that's what's happening, and that's what happens everywhere all the time.
Everywhere all the time. Everywhere all the time. Okay, so Marxism. It has to be. It's about Marxism. Marco Rubio and Marxism, and Biden not condemning the Marxism.
Because Marxism is about that happens everywhere all the time. If only it was happening everywhere all the time.
But I gotta say, like, what's interesting about Cuba, and like just from being there, and again, anecdotally, but there are the opposite problems of extreme unfettered capitalism, right? There's free education to get to become a doctor. And yet you're not making enough money to really make ends meet. So you ditch that, go drive a cab, because you're making more money driving a cab than you are as a doctor. Well, obviously, I think that's probably not a good thing. You need some amount of incentive to do the hard work to be a doctor day in and day out. It's not an easy job. No one's saying it is, right? But at the same time, like, do we want the extreme wealth that has infected our privatized medical system in this country, right? Do we want the extreme inequality that is in the rest of Latin America? So it's almost like el mundo al revés, the world on its head. And so in that sense, it's like, if the trade-off for living under communism, I think, and this is interesting, is like healthcare, education, food, but like, a little bit of lack of democracy, I think many people around the world might take that trade-off. Like, they might be like, no, that sounds actually okay. Right. Including in this country. I mean, including me. Like, I'm like, I don't know how I would feel about that. If we had only one party, which we pretty much do already, but all of our needs were taken care of, I mean, I think democracy sometimes is overrated. Look at 2016, man.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's, I think, and I heard this a lot from Cubans in Cuba, is a sentiment of like, none of us are perfect. None of us have all the answers. People need to be able to come together and learn from each other's strengths and learn from each other's weaknesses and build a better world together. I don't think our choice has to be the United States model, where we have, our freedom is 5,000 cable channels, but in exchange, 600,000 people die of COVID, and we're running out of slave labor to fight our climate catastrophe, forest fires. While Republicans are passing laws to make it legal to drive cars into protesters. Or Cuba. Like, I don't think it's that binary. Like, I think you can say
there's always Denmark.
Yeah, there's always Denmark. I think the way what we want to say is that what can we learn from this model? How do we build on it? How do we improve it? We don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater with any of these systems. And so making it about, a conversation about like, as Marco Rubio does, this is what Marxism is, and therefore, if you support Marxism, you support 100% of these things. Like, whether or not that even is accurate, that's what Marxism is. Like, that's not how the world works. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's not how societies are created. That societies are created through political contestation. So we need more of that.
So it's not just about ideology.
It's not just about ideology.
There you go. I think that's a great way to put it. And do you have a second to talk about Haiti, or do you have to bounce, Nato?
I do have to, I have to go in a minute. I also think before you get to Haiti, I think it's important. I just want to say one more thing,
Please.
which is the best news of the week is that Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro had 2 pounds of feces removed from his intestine and was hospitalized for it. So I don't
2
think
pounds?
I don't
Did you say
think
2 pounds or 2 kinds of feces?
2 pounds.
Oh, so he was just backed up?
I don't think the Frente. It was this funny story to follow during the course of the week. Bolsonaro hospitalized with hiccups. That's a weird story. Then Bolsonaro has 2 pounds of feces removed from his abdomen.
Now,
So,
is that, I feel like that's a lot of feces, right? Surely we shouldn't, like, maybe there's like half a pound in there somewhere, right?
I mean, Francesca, everybody knows that you don't actually poop.
I don't poop, obviously.
I know. I don't know if the Frentifa knows this, but Francesca doesn't actually have a butthole.
No, it's just smooth. I'm like a Barbie.
Yeah. So, she just secretes her waste like in vapor form.
Yeah. It smells great, actually. It smells like roses. Well, Nato, thank you so much for breaking all of that down. I really appreciate it. And I guess maybe the last question I'll ask is, what do you feel like the off-ramp is, or the wind down is, when it comes to, Cuba transitioning into a place that does have like more shops and trade and more internet and more press freedoms and some dissent and like, do you feel like the government was already headed there? And now that this one act of resistance has been super politicized internationally, they're like going to retract. They're go back into their corners. Beyond the immediate need to drop the effing embargo, I don't know. Like, what are your thoughts on the future?
Yeah, I mean, we could always be surprised. That's always a possibility. That it seems I will be surprised if the government and socialism collapses. I think that that's unlikely to occur as long as the embargo is in place, because, as you were saying earlier, the embargo allows the government to call people to rally around the flag.
Right.
So the but and this is the current protests are the most visible expression of it. But for years, like people in Cuba sort of talk about it as like a permanent tug of war. That there's always a tug of war. Like when I was there, I met one painter who said, in Eastern Europe, the artists they were into socialist realism, where they made art as propaganda for the government, and we weren't into doing that. We like to keep the censors busy. There's always a tug of war between the Cuban people and the government over the extent of liberalization. And if there's one step forward and 2 steps back, you've seen this with the growth of the private sector, where there's an expansion of private enterprise and then greater regulation of private enterprise. There's expansion of civil liberties through the internet and restriction. And so I think it's not expressed in the form of like multi-party elections and that kind of 15,000 cable channels, but there is clearly there's been domestic struggle, and so my guess is that there will continue to be. And if I were a betting person, what I would bet is that the government figures out how to give people enough concessions that the protesters calm down. But it falls short of complete system change.
Right. The question is how strapped are they actually? And it feels like they are. I think would give more concessions if they just economically could even afford them.
Right. But I also think it's unlikely, for example, that they're gonna like Marco Rubio is talking about violence and getting killed. I read one study that like since over the decades, the Cuban government has actually executed something like 500 people. that there were people who were literally invading, like in the Bay of Pigs or whatever, and subsequent, attempts by CIA-backed spies to invade Cuba that they killed. But Cuba's not a country where there's like mass graves and executions. And like, I spent time in Guatemala where entire villages were exterminated. And like, Cuba has problems, but it's not when they're like, there's dictatorship, and they're not doing mass disappearances and exterminations. Literal genocide. So like, I also don't think we're going to see a situation where like thousands of people are getting executed as a result of this. The other thing that's likely to occur, just because it's a pressure release valve for the country, is that that they're going to figure out how to let people leave. Because one of the policy changes that happened under Obama that is now becoming controversial is there was this wet foot, dry foot policy where if a Cuban, there were all these boat people, and if you made it to U.S. shore, you could get residency.
Right.
And that was seen as and it was like this discriminatory policy where if you walk from El Salvador, you get deported. But if you sail to Florida on a raft from Cuba, you can stay. And so Cuba was offended by that. And so as part of the Obama thaw, he gave that up. And that never got reinstated. That was the one Obama policy that didn't get reversed by Trump. And so now they have a bunch of people. And this frankly, I mean, it's bitter. It's not good. But this also happened with Venezuela, where because of all the instability, a bunch of people left, which in some ways made things easier in the country. So I would also suspect that Cuba figures out how to just let people leave.
allow people to leave. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nato. This is great. I'm so glad you were free. Thanks for taking the time.
Good to see everybody.
Everybody follow Nato Green at Nato Green on Twitter and Mr. Nato Green on Instagram. And you can see him here whenever. And obviously he's got amazing comedy albums you guys should be checking out. Bye, Nato. And thank you guys for sticking around. Hey, what up? Are you liking and sharing the stream? I'm going to do a stream a little bit more. Become a patron, patreon.com/Bituation Room. If you're not already, you get special shout outs. You're going to get some merch and then early access to bonus episodes. This, however, is a stream. It's just a stream. But figuring out ways to thank all the people and all the Frantifa who are already around. I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of communism, socialism, etc. And I do think it's interesting because, as Nato was talking about, the framework of communism and the way that communism functions in Cuba, not being mass graves, yes, there have definitely been political dissidents that have faced torture and imprisonment. No one's saying there's not. There's things like censorship. There's things like, LGBTQ clampdowns. But by and large, when it comes to basic necessities, up until now, people were getting their needs met in terms of healthcare, education, etc., housing, and things like that. But it's a fairly rigid regime. It's a rigid ass regime, right? And I think it's really interesting to compare that to Venezuela. And I'm not an expert on Venezuela at all, but it is interesting that Hugo Chavez when he came to power in like the, early 2000s was trying to basically create like what he called a Bolivarian socialism. He didn't call it communism. He called it socialism. And there were things like, money for neighborhood councils that actually had dissidents in them. Like there was money for radio stations. And so like, organizers and activists and people on the ground could have a radio show and they could talk crap about the government and no one was going to come find them and like lock them up. So there was a far less of a crackdown on dissent in Venezuela, at least in the beginning, right? Venezuela under Nicolas Maduro has really gone off the rails, and also for a number of reasons in terms of their economy, which is so pegged to oil money and so pegged to the dollar. So the foreign currency and the oil dependency, again, makes that country incredibly unstable and unable to be self-sufficient in that way. Whereas interesting, you have a country like Bolivia that's nearby that, under Morales, who obviously is, was sort of low key or high key couped not so long ago and left the country, But the United States didn't really give a shit about Bolivia. They were like, oh, it's fine. There's nothing there that we really want. There's no oil. There's not that many elitists who are like, living in Miami and like putting pressure on our politicians. Bolivia's kind of chill, whatever. And under that, Evo Morales was able to pass, a bunch of legislative changes, giving more rights to indigenous communities, workers, and also like, the actual land itself in terms of protecting it. Again, not beyond critique. Morales, I think the biggest critique that I have is that they don't allow for elections and within their own system of government, right? They've worked incredibly hard to get elected under democracy, but then keep on extending their administrations. And sometimes they're, legitimately elected, as in the case of Evo Morales, who was legitimately reelected. Media says he wasn't. Then he was toppled in essentially a parliamentarian-esque coup. Now, my problem isn't necessarily that he isn't that he, I think that he legitimately won. I'm not saying he didn't legitimately win, but I am saying that, like, why are you still running 10 years after you were elected? Like, you know what I mean? And I think the more that a socialist government can create avenues and spaces for democracy and for, free and fair elections, and even people who are going to challenge them within their own party and without, the better. The problem is you're always going to have a handful of landed, wealthy, and foreign-funded elites who are going to try and topple you no matter what. So it's this like balancing act. It's a very, it is a interesting balancing act that I am fascinated by and have been for years. As people who know that I've worked on, a magazine called Left Turn way back in the day. And we talked about, the intricacies and how interesting Bolivarian socialism in the 21st century was, and this project that Hugo Chavez was building, and the project that Evo Morales was building, and the pink tide, as they say. So I think people are so quick to do two things. One, read Marx and apply it to a country. Like, this is what we do. We do Marx stuff. We do Marxism. That's not the way ideology and works, right? And I think the second thing is looking at places where, like in Cuba or like in Venezuela, where there has been a crumbling of the economy and a crumbling of the social fabric. And they say the entire baby gets to be thrown out with the bathwater. All of socialism is bad. All of communism, like, they should have never nationalized the oil. They should have never, kicked out these foreign investors. That's the problem. And I think the reality is somewhere in between. And I know the right hates when I say that. The right wing gets so mad that, I believe in death squads. And no, man, that's like CIA who believes in death squads. That's all the work that the United States has done to maintain and fight against so-called communism, i.e., just more sovereignty and control in the hands of people. I got to be honest with you, I'm not a big fan of like big government generally. Not big government in the way that the right wing conceives of it, but very top-down, very opaque, non-transparent, secretive form of government that I think, like in Cuba, they have. Not a big fan of that. But I am a big fan of people like getting their basic needs met. And also being able to be a thumb in the eye of the United States that had used Cuba as an outpost for any kind of, shady business deal to exploitative, just an offshore account come to life. Anywho, speaking of other places that have been pummeled by U.S. Imperialism and involvement, I do want to talk about Haiti a little bit and what's been going on. Obviously, I think it is relevant now because of the language that is being used to talk about Cuba. Communism has failed, and look at this, and it's such a mess. Oh my God. Haiti. The answer to that is Haiti, a country not very far, in fact, right next to Cuba, that is suffering immeasurable amounts of instability right now because of the assassination of their president, right? But that comes on the back of decades and decades and decades of instability, as the United States has been perpetually meddling, propping up, funneling billions into that country, utilizing it as a free trade zone to get cheap goods, calling all kinds of foreign investors and businesses to set up effective sweatshops in Haiti, quote unquote, giving people jobs. And none of it's worked. So here you have a Caribbean nation pillaged and plundered and punished for its own resistance, to French rule, obviously, and to the slave uprising years and 100 years ago, whenever that was. And the legacy of that is today. And Haiti didn't have a communist revolution like Cuba did, right? And yet it's sort of we have these mirror experiences of what Cuba could have been, of what Haiti could have been. I want to just go to what's happening now because there's more details coming out. And my God, the stuff out of Haiti gets shadier and shadier and shadier by the moment. And also more weird American involvement. So this is from the New York Times. Suspects in Haitian president's killing met to plan a future without him. So Haitian officials contend that Christian Emmanuel Sanon, a doctor and pastor who divided his time between Florida and Haiti, conspired with others to take the reins of the country once Mr. Moise was killed. During a raid of Mr. Sanon's residence, they say the police found 6 holsters, 20 box of bullets, and a DEA cap, suggesting that it linked him to the killing because the team of men who struck Mr. Moise's home posed as agents of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Now, I get that a lot of Haitians do not even trust the Haitian police to accurately investigate what happened. Totally understand that. I'm just reading these reports. The Haitian authorities took Mr. Sanon into custody, but offered little explanation as to how Sanon, who did not hold elected office, planned to take over once the president was killed. So this guy wanted to be president. He was not in office. He's not even next in line. He's not one of the 3 people currently contesting that they should be president right now. It was also difficult to understand how he might have financed a team of Colombian mercenaries. Remember, many of the people who were arrested were Colombian mercenaries, some of whom received American military training when they were members of their nation's armed forces to carry out such an ambitious assault, given that he filed in Florida for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in 2013. The depths of ridiculousness. So my man living in Florida hired a bunch of formerly American trained Colombian mercenaries to kill the president, Jovenel Moise, and then step into his role. What? It gets weirder. There's more people with more ties to the United States, actually. Among the participants in these meetings, which, by the way, guys, I didn't get this. They planned this on Zoom. This has got to be one of the first Zoom planned coups. Which really is a coup for Zoom. I mean, if you think about it. All right. So the participants were Mr. Duverger said, were at least 2 other key suspects who have since been identified by Haitian officials as central figures in the plot. One was Antonio Intriago, who owns a private security and equipment company that hired former Colombian commandos and brought them into Haiti. The other was Walter Ventimilla, who leads a small financial services company in Miramar, Florida called Worldwide Capital Lending Group. On Wednesday, the Haitian authorities accused him of helping to finance the assassination plot. Now, I know more is going to unfold after this when it comes to what exactly happened in Haiti, but I raise this and I bring all these insane, sordid details into it to explain that here is a country where Jovenel Moise, that the United States was backing, even beyond when they should have been backing him, who ruled by decree, essentially, who was clamping down on protests just in the way that the Cuban government is clamping down on protests, that in order to topple this guy, there's a bunch of bizarre right-wing mercenary private capital companies and like financing entities that are running money into a coup plot against this guy. And like, you can only imagine. We talked about the future of what will happen to Cuba. I can only imagine the small finance capital firms that are proposing to some random Cuban dissident or expat that they should be the next president, and all they've got to do is hire these mercenaries, go in there. I mean, it's not beyond the pale, right? Obviously, the country's got to get in a lot worse shape, i.e. in the shape of Haiti, to even get there. But this is what happens when a country has been so utterly devastated and ravaged by corruption, by crony capitalism, by foreign entities, by corporations. You get Haiti, where the people come last. So obviously there was a huge earthquake, I believe in 2010. And Haiti got $13 billion since that earthquake, and still hasn't managed to actually have a functioning government that respects, humanitarian rights, human rights, civil rights, with a robust economy, with jobs. This is from the New York Times also. Why Haiti still despairs after $13 billion in foreign aid. Since a powerful earthquake devastated the country in 2010, foreign aid seems only to have helped perpetuate some of the country's biggest troubles. And this person writes, Haiti is less a failed state than what an analyst called an aid state, eking out an existence by relying on billions of dollars from the international community. Foreign governments have been unwilling to turn off the spigots, afraid to let Haiti fail. I mean, what could be worse, right? There's already gangs and drug money and insane insecurity and instability, violence. I think it's failed. I think it failed on your watch. If you're trying to take ownership over Haiti. And guys, what I mean by that is the Clintons, I love the BS Clinton body count conspiracy, because all you've got to do is look at Haiti and be like, oh, no, there's the body count. It's Haiti. So the Clintons and the Clinton Foundation, I believe, basically worked backdoor deals to make sure that corporations had a home in Haiti for cheap labor. They rallied against, this is in the late 90s, I believe, they rallied against a wage increase for Haitian workers that was something like 40 cents or something, a 40-cent increase for Haitian workers, a minimum wage increase, and they worked against it in Haiti so that Hanes Underwear and Victoria's Secret and other companies that have used Haiti as just a ridiculous free trade zone of underpaid and exploitative labor could continue to do that. Again, that is extreme capitalism. That's what that looks like in the Caribbean. That's what foreign intervention looks like in the Caribbean. That's what Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and others want to see out of Cuba. They don't want to see mom and pop shops getting influxes of money in order to run, bed and breakfasts and, hardware stores and making deals with companies in Florida to support their, no. They don't want that. They want sweatshops. They want Targets and Walmarts and Amazon processing centers, right? That's the future. That would be success, supposedly. There's nothing about building a nation there. It's about cheap labor. And that is the role of the Caribbean in the minds of the United States and a lot of the world, sadly. Anywho, I so appreciate y'all being here. I'm sorry that I haven't gotten to many of your comments. Chuck Diesel, Zoom is now guilty by association. So funny. I knew it. Zoom's done some shady stuff. Let's all agree. Guys, before we go, let's do one last thing. I just thought this was funny, and I hope this will work. And it's just something that has been bothering me a little bit. You got to bear with me. My mind is obviously on my cat, who's I hope she's stuck with one fang. She's going to be a one-fanged cat. Is a cat with only one fang still a cat? How do I deal with this as a mom? Sound off in the comments. All right. So this is James Carville, who recently went on Chris Cuomo. Already, I hate the sentence I just said. And talked about the noisy identity left as the reason that Democrats are losing. Now, I think his point is more nuanced than the headline, which was, him sounding off about the identity obsessed left. I think his point is a little more nuanced, and I want to talk about why. But also, his point is incredibly basic, and we hear it so often, not just from centrist Democrats, but even some people on the left, and definitely from right wingers. So I do want to share. See if I can pull this up. This is my homies at archive.org. These guys are great. If you ever are looking for video clips, man, they are good. So here they are talking. So they're talking about the comparing the like far right, basically comparing the Republican Party crazies and supposedly the left crazies. Let's see if y'all can hear this. Okay. Okay, they're talking about some other crap right now. Can you not hear? Oh, no sound? Okay, my bad. All right, my bad. We're redoing this. Everything's fine. Everything is fine. Here we go. I'm at a good place. Okay.
I mean, Biden did a little worse, but he did better with suburban women. He did better with veterans. Not to belabor your point, we did lose traction with black voters and Hispanic voters. And I think part of that is we got identified by the defund the police and the language police. And that's not who Biden is. Biden didn't even know what wokeness is. He couldn't explain it to him. And I think that the Democratic Party, I'm very encouraged.
Okay, can you guys, I guess it's like really, really low. I apologize for that. I didn't pull this sound. All right, so you see his little face. You see his face. Let me read you instead of showing you exactly what he said. Because I think it is it's important. It's important to talk about this and just the ways that this dude constantly says this kind of stuff. Squibbity dib. I can't turn it up, you guys. I can't turn it up. Just stay. Don't hate me. I'm all alone. I don't have a producer with me today. I didn't have time. I was trying to prepare good things for you to feast your eyes on about Cuba. Don't judge me. Hang on. Good fucking God. I can't fucking find it. Give me a sec. Anyone who leaves is a little scared ass bitch. That's what you are. Yeah? Yes, you are. That is what you are. Okay. So Carville said, ad blockers, kill me now. He says, basically he was saying, the whole noisy identity left is 15% of the Democratic Party. 2/3 of Republicans agree with these loony insurrectionists. Hang on. Let's do it again. So James Carville went on Chris Cuomo, and he had a lot to say about the noisy left that is obsessed with identity. And this is him. I don't have a video clip, but I'm just going to read it in his voice. The whole noisy identity left is 15% of the Democratic Party. 2/3 Republicans agree with these loony insurrectionists and this kind of stuff. Yet we pay such a terrible price politically for a slightly more fringe element of our party. Okay, so what he's saying there is 15% of the Democratic Party is, according to him, like identity obsessed leftists. But we pay a bigger price, Democrats do, for those 15% than what Republicans pay for the 2/3 of them who believe that the election was stolen and, like, you know, Trump actually won in Arizona or whatever. He's not wrong about that. He's not wrong that, like, what the way I would put it would be that, like, let's say people who are like abolish ICE, which I agree with, and defund the police, which I agree with, but I'm a fringe lefty, that we get more shine and we have to, like, we are heralded and not heralded, but we are put into the spotlight by right wingers, and asked by Democrats to condemn us, right? You know, that Ilhan Omar saying something very on point about how both the United States and the Taliban have terrorized the Afghan people, that Democrats have to run, you know, defense to that small opinion, which is a good opinion, but it's like relatively a small number of Democrats that hold that opinion. Whereas Republicans are just openly endorsing insurrection and openly saying that it is fine to contest this election, and yet openly not saying that Trump actually did lose, and they never get held to account for that. So in that, I think he's right. I think he is right. He calls it the whole noisy identity left. However, the identity left. Now, what do we mean by identity left? I'm sure he means people who think that race and racism matter, right? Because this is the way he says it. The most important constituents in our party are blacks and suburban women. First of all, I don't like the way you said blacks. They're not into this, all right? And again, we're seeing it time and again. We're letting a noisy wing of our party define the rest of us. And my point is, we can't do that. I think these people are kind of nice people. I think they're naive. I think they're all into language and identity, and that's not right. They're not storming the Capitol, but they're not winning elections. And I think some people see that for what it is, and people way more interested in their lives and how to improve them than they are in somebody else's pronouns or something. People are more interested in their lives than someone else's pronouns or something. Well, someone else's pronouns might actually get them killed or not. Someone else accepting someone else's pronouns is a difference between life and death for many trans people in this country. So have a little bit of a problem with that. But you see the way he's going. It's Democrats are too concerned with their little fifi pet issues that are supposedly trans issues, right? That is so fringe, and that, you know, they're too into talking about being black and brown and how Black Lives Matter and blah 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 blah, and they need to just win elections. Cori Bush, Black Lives Matter organizer. She why am I blanking on where she's from? In Minnesota, right? You guys, my brain is on my cat. Cori Bush won St. Louis. Thank you. Missouri, not Minnesota. Cori Bush won her election. The squad is growing. Now, I think James Carville needs to be direct. He needs to say, we centrist Democrats are losing elections. Y'all are losing elections. But the people talking about Medicare for all, the people talking about Black Lives Matter, the people talking about a Green New Deal, the people talking about climate change, the people talking about, you know, justice for the LGBTQ community, those people are winning elections. Pramila Jayapal has a trans kid, is openly talking about that. Keeps winning her election, right? Katie Porter. These are people who are winning their elections. In fact, I would argue that the so-called fringe of the Democratic Party is the only reason that Democrats even win at all. That the squad is the only reason that people still have any faith in the Democratic Party, because we're actually electing better Democrats. Because we've got people like Justice Dems out there in front, you know? That's why. So it's, and I just think it's so ridiculous also to equate Because I think what happens is a lot of centrist Democrats, a lot of news outlets and anchors, they equate the right's fringe with the left's fringe. Well, the left's fringe wants crazy things like, healthcare for everybody and childcare. And the right wants a white power police state that overturns elections and stops teachers from teaching about critical race theory. What? These two things are not equal, and to the Republicans' credit, they see that the most energy, devoid of morals, they see the most energy in their party is coming from a fucking far right Nazi movement. And they're like, yeah, I think we'll go with that. Yeah. Oh, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, MAGA. Hell yeah, let's go with that. We'll do that. Mitch McConnell's like, ooh, let's do that. Because that will get our agenda passed. Ooh, yeah. And Democrats are too stupid to realize that their energy is not only different, but it's where the energy is in the Democratic Party. And that Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi should be saying, ooh, yeah. Green New Deal? Yeah, let's go with that because we're going to win elections. Oh, yeah, because guess what? That 15% fringe that James Carville thinks is fringe are young people. And there are more of us. And we're getting older. And we can vote more. And we were not born yesterday. So that fringe is your only lifeline to being relevant, buddy. Not to mention Cori Bush of St. Louis, of Missouri, my bad, is one of the only Congress people also to say that the people who aided and abetted insurrection, like it says in our Constitution, you can no longer do, they should be gone. They should be out. That the crazies in the Republican Party should be gone. Schumer doesn't have the balls to say that. Manchin sure as hell doesn't have the balls to say that. Sinema doesn't have the balls to say that. So, Black Lives Matter, trans rights, these are not pet issues. Just because they are held up by the right wing as so-called pet issues doesn't mean they are. Just because they're seen as identity, oh, your little identity issues, they're not. They're not small. They're about civil rights. They're about whether or not you die in the street with a police officer on your neck or you survive. So the last thing I'll say on this is I've seen leftists play into this all the time. Leftists play into the idea that identity politics and that wokeism, that's the real reason that the left isn't stronger, is because we're too focused on identity and we're too focused on race and gender and not focused enough on class. Well, why not all three? That's been my response. Why not all three? And stop with the Trump and MAGA appeal to the working class. We know they don't. The stats say they don't. Okay? They're boat dads. They're independently wealthy. They fly private jets to go do an insurrection. So none of this populist meet in the middle BS. And none of this, all we have to do is throw Black people and trans people and women's issues under the bus and focus on class and we'll get the government we want. No. And I would like to say that Bernie Sanders' campaign absolutely proved that you don't have to do that, And I don't think that campaign was above criticism when it comes to reaching out and actually working with Black and brown community leaders to be in his campaign. But I think he did a very good job at creating a multiracial, anti-racist, feminist, pro-LGBTQ plus political movement. And I hope leftists remember that when you listen or you platform people like James fucking Carville, or you say, oh, James is right, maybe we are too focused on identity, that is some neo-lib centrist bullshit. Okay? That is the shit that after Hillary lost, the one thing I didn't agree with was people being like, well, did she focus too much on gender? No, she was just a bad candidate. And gender was one of the things that probably the only thing she had, right? Oh, did we focus, no. Shh, we're not going to be, we're not going to be baited by that horrible argument. Anywho, why is Chris Cuomo still on CNN? Okay. Thank you guys for dealing with my brain farts, me being worried about my cat, and for talking about Cuba and Latin America. I love this. I love you all. And yes, thank you so much for being here, guys. Thanks to Chuck Diesel and to Todd Roy, as always, for all the people on Twitch, for the people who've subscribed. Thank you, Zaddy Lad. AOC is right. I see your comments, y'all. I love you. And hey, if you can, subscribe on Twitch, become a patron, patreon.com/bitchuationroom. It really means the world. And if you can't, I totally understand. Hey, head on to Apple Podcasts and write this podcast a review. Give it 5 stars. You know it's me and my labor of love. You know I don't even, Mama don't even have sound. I will stop referring to myself as Mama. I'm thinking of my cat. Okay, you guys, see you Sunday. We've got a great show on Sunday. We're talking about Indigenous rights, and we're talking about Britney Spears, bitch. Hell yeah. I love that those two things are in one episode. Sunday at 5/8 Eastern. Do not miss it. Take very